Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome back to Tag Tuesday. Today, I thought I would respond to the interesting questions that Alan of Big Hard Books and Classics asks in his I'm Mental tag. Before I get started, I want to mention that he made this tag partly to call attention to the issue of mental health, and I encourage you to go watch his video to hear his thoughts. Alan was kind enough to tag me in his original video, and James Holder was kind enough to type out the questions, which I've copied in the show notes. Okay, on to the questions. Number 1, has someone ever dared you to read a book? I don't think so, or at least not really. The closest I've come to being dared to read a book was by an author. Years ago, decades ago, I guess, I ran across a book in the small Barnes & Noble located at the train station, right before I hopped on a train that would take me from D.C., where I was teaching, to Philadelphia, where my sweetie, now my spouse David, was finishing up medical school. The book was a new, expanded edition of Clifton Fadiman's Lifetime Reading Plan. I don't know what inspired me to pick it up, but as I started skimming through as the train pulled away from the station, I started checking off the books I'd actually read. The really huge hole right there near the very beginning, Homer's Iliad. I had absolutely no intention of reading some book about obnoxious men and some big war, no matter how old and classic the book was. Dead white man, blah, blah, blah. Of course, I'd read the Odyssey and really enjoyed it. And there was Fadiman telling me that to be well read, I had to read not just one book by Homer, but the other one too. And his dare worked. Resentfully, I picked up a copy of the book. Actually, I bought the Iliad in the same Barnes & Noble at the train station when I returned from my weekend with David. And I suspect you already have guessed the outcome of this story. I absolutely loved the Iliad, more than the Odyssey, in fact. Much to my surprise, there were so many parts of it that felt incredibly fresh to me, moving and thoughtful and very contemporary, which was not what I was expecting at all. After I started thinking about my answers to this tag, I watched Brian at Bookish say he had no interest in reading the Iliad, and his dismissal makes me want to reread the book, perhaps in a different translation this time, and make a full video to persuade him otherwise. It may take me a while, but that video is now on my do eventually list. In fact, given the way Alan framed the tag question, I think I will dare Brian to read the Iliad. Yes? Question 2. Who is a writer who, to translate Alan's wording into language my grandmother would approve of, as he asked, has been attacked for one reason or another? I'm going to name Flannery O'Connor here. She's an author who writes a lot about characters who are actively racist, including using language that's now considered completely unacceptable to voice, even when trying to explain how racism functions in a society. O'Connor uses that language in the mouths of particular characters, and other characters do not use the same language, although many of them are also extremely flawed characters in various ways. The racism is not O'Connor's when she's doing this kind of writing. It's the racism of the particular characters, which the author is trying to highlight. That isn't necessarily to say that O'Connor herself was not a racist, perhaps especially by today's understandings rather than those standards of her day and her white community. A few years ago, Paul Ely published a fairly inflammatory essay in The New Yorker suggesting that Flannery O'Connor had, as he said, a habit of bigotry. Although he points out that the most frequent and most extreme examples are from her youth, he also pulls out quotations from her much later work that fits. Ely rejects the context argument, that is, the argument that somehow O'Connor and her ilk can be forgiven because she lived at a time and place saturated with bigoted perspectives, And despite the fact that many readers see a strong critique of racism in some of her stories, she still agreed to live by the standards around her. Ely doesn't want to let her off the hook. After all, she lived in the same period that Maya Angelou and Derek Walcott and Gabriel Garcia Marquez and other non-white authors lived, even Toni Morrison. And when many were producing their work that stepped beyond the racism of the white South. True and important. But still, those authors didn't grow up with a kind of racial ideology that O'Connor did, and they weren't expected to honor it either. Loyola University decided to strip O'Connor's name from one of the dormitories at the Catholic College. The dorm had been named after her a little more than a decade ago. And after Ely's New Yorker article was published, over 1,000 people signed an online petition to erase Flannery O'Connor's name. To be honest, I suspect many of the signers had not read anything but the headline of the essay exploring O'Connor's racism, not the full essay itself, and not the fiction written by O'Connor. The petition stated that some of the author's, quote, recent postcards and letters contain racist ideology. They do. But really, how recent can they be, given that O'Connor has been dead for more than 50 years? Many authors of color expressed their concern about the decision, including such luminaries as Alice Walker. The university president wanted to honor the opinions of the students who would have to live in that building every day and make it their home. But at the same time, he was clear he found the issue to be a lot more complex than many people thought it was. As he said, particularly in her fiction, the dignity of African American persons and their worth is consistently upheld, with the bigots being the object of ridicule. I would argue that racism appears in O'Connor's characters perhaps because she herself was a racist, but also because that was how O'Connor knew how to critique racism. This really isn't the place to have a full discussion about whether or not to read racist authors, or why to read racist authors at all, which, as an historian, I would argue is absolutely essential for at least scholars to do. So I'll leave it at that. She's an author who gets a fair bit of hate, at least some of which may be undeserved. Oh, and don't miss the Booktube event Flannery O'January, which I will leave links to in the description box. I'm going to try to film a little something for it by the end of the month if I can, too. Okay, question 3. Do you think you can predict the future? No. However, I can often foresee what's going to happen in books or in movies or whatever. Like most of you who read a lot, I often recognize tropes or even whole genres that go in certain directions and see foreshadowing, even when authors don't necessarily intend it. Very, very rarely does the ending of a well-constructed book surprise me. I'm also really interested in trying to figure out what makes real people in my life tick, and often that means I can anticipate particular situations. But that isn't predicting the future in the way Alan means. Question 4. What is a favorite book you don't want to admit? Honestly, I don't think I shy away from admitting that I love anything. If I love it and think it might seem like a weird or unacceptable choice to others, I usually try to figure out why I love a book, so I can petition for its worth to other people. I suppose if I really couldn't figure out a reason why I love a book, either because I loved the book itself or because of when I first read it or when I first learned about it, I don't think I would be at all ashamed to just admit that I loved a book that might surprise other people. So for this tag, I think I'll turn this question on its head. What's a book I don't want to admit I haven't enjoyed or haven't read? I'm a little ashamed that I really didn't love War and Peace enough to keep holding it up night after night and having it crash on my face when my arms got tired. I also felt like I was reading soap opera material. I haven't finished it. And so I'm really not condemning it. Instead, I'm embarrassed I didn't absolutely love it, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't finish it. I will at some point, although probably not this year. Well, that's the last question. I know Alan tagged a number of people in his original version, and I think I'll tag Steve Donahue, who I know will get worked up over all of these questions. I'm looking forward to seeing what answers he comes out with and what you come out with. Thanks, Alan, for creating this tag and sending it my way. And thanks to all of you for joining me here. See you soon, next time on Hannah's Books.